August 12, 1948, Fredericksburg, Texas. Klaus Hartmann stood before a justice of the peace in a borrowed suit 2 sizes too large, his calloused hands trembling as he slipped a simple gold band onto the finger of Margaret Sullivan. The small courthouse room held only 6 witnesses, half the town still refusing to attend the wedding of a former enemy soldier to one of their own. Margaret's father sat rigid in the front row, jaw clenched, while her mother dabbed tears that could have been joy or grief or both. 3 years earlier, Klaus had arrived in Texas as a prisoner of war, convinced he would never see his homeland again. Now he was pledging his life to a woman whose brother had died fighting men who wore the same uniform Klaus once wore. The transformation from enemy to husband seemed impossible, yet here they stood, 2 people who should never have met, binding their lives together in a country that had been at war with his only months before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The story of how Klaus Hartmann came to stand in that Texas courthouse began in the winter of 1943, in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy rather than create love. Klaus was 23 years old when his Afrika Korps unit surrendered to British forces near Tunis in May 1943. He had spent 18 months in the North African desert, watching friends die from bullets, disease, and the relentless sun that turned metal too hot to touch. The surrender came as relief mixed with shame, the peculiar emotion of a soldier grateful to survive but humiliated by defeat. British forces processed thousands of German prisoners in makeshift camps near the Tunisian coast. Klaus spent 6 weeks in a tent city where dust infiltrated every meal and dysentery killed more men than combat had in the final weeks of fighting. In July 1943, he and 300 other prisoners were loaded onto a transport ship bound for an unknown destination. The voyage lasted 19 days, prisoners packed into cargo holds that stank of unwashed bodies and vomit. Guards provided minimal information about their destination. Rumors circulated constantly. Some prisoners insisted they were bound for Canada, others swore they were headed to England, a few believed they would be sent to the Soviet Union, a fate all of them feared more than death. The ship docked in Norfolk, Virginia on August 2, 1943. Klaus first glimpsed America through the porthole of a cargo hold, seeing a coastline that looked impossibly green after months of African desert and weeks at sea. Processing at Camp Lee took 3 days. American soldiers photographed prisoners, recorded their information, and issued new clothing. Klaus received 2 sets of work clothes, each stamped with large letters reading PW in white paint. The letters marked him as prisoner of war, a designation that would define his existence for the next 3 years. From Virginia, Klaus traveled by train to Texas. The journey took 4 days, crossing landscapes that amazed him with their scale. Germany could fit into Texas twice over with room remaining. The train carried 200 prisoners under guard of 30 American soldiers. Klaus spoke enough English to understand guards discussing their destination, a prisoner of war camp outside a town called Fredericksburg in the Texas Hill Country. Camp Fredericksburg was one of 700 prisoner of war camps established across the United States during the war. The American military faced a significant problem by mid-1943. Hundreds of thousands of German and Italian prisoners required secure detention, but building and maintaining camps in Britain or North Africa strained logistics already stretched supporting combat operations. The solution was to ship prisoners to camps in the American interior, far from any coast where escape might lead to enemy territory. Texas, with its vast empty spaces and desperate need for agricultural labor, became home to dozens of these camps. Klaus arrived at Camp Fredericksburg on August 19, 1943. The camp occupied 200 acres of scrubland 12 miles outside town. Double rows of barbed wire fencing surrounded 50 wooden barracks, each building designed to house 40 prisoners. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned by soldiers whose primary job was to prevent escape, though escape into the Texas wilderness seemed suicidal to most prisoners. The camp also held administrative buildings, a mess hall, a small hospital, and a recreation area where prisoners could play football on weekends. Camp Commandant Colonel Richard Brennan ran the facility according to Geneva Convention requirements. Prisoners received adequate food, medical care, and basic recreation. They could not be forced to work in jobs directly supporting the war effort, but could be assigned to agricultural labor, food processing, or other civilian work. The American government paid prisoners 80 cents per day in camp scrip, currency valid only in the camp canteen where prisoners could purchase cigarettes, candy, and writing materials. The Texas Hill Country surrounding Fredericksburg was home to numerous German immigrant families who had settled the region in the 1840s. Many residents still spoke German at home and maintained cultural traditions from the old country. This created a peculiar situation where German prisoners of war found themselves working on farms owned by German Americans, some of whom had sons fighting against Germany in Europe. The cultural complexity made every interaction fraught with unspoken tension. Klaus spent his first 2 months at Camp Fredericksburg adjusting to captivity. The physical conditions were far better than anything he had experienced in North Africa. Barracks had wooden floors, real beds with mattresses, and protection from weather. Food was plain but plentiful, a shocking contrast to the starvation rations of the final months in Tunisia. But the psychological weight of imprisonment crushed many prisoners into depression. Klaus watched men sit motionless for hours, staring at nothing, minds trapped in memories of home or combat or the moment of surrender. In October 1943, camp authorities began assigning prisoners to work details on local farms. The Hill Country was suffering acute labor shortages as young men enlisted or were drafted into military service. Cotton needed picking, cattle required tending, and harvests rotted in fields for lack of hands to gather them. Local farmers initially resisted employing enemy prisoners, but economic necessity overcame patriotic reluctance. The government offered farmers prisoner labor at reasonable rates, with prisoners earning their 80 cents daily while farmers paid standard wages to the camp. Klaus was assigned to a work detail in late October. Each morning, a truck collected 20 prisoners from camp and transported them to various farms in the region. Armed guards accompanied each detail, though their primary job seemed to be preventing prisoners from wandering rather than stopping actual escape attempts. The first farm Klaus worked belonged to the Schneider family, German immigrants who had arrived in Texas in 1852. Old Heinrich Schneider spoke German with his prisoners, a dialect that sounded archaic to Klaus but was understandable. Schneider treated prisoners fairly, providing water during breaks and allowing them to rest in shade during the hottest part of the day. Working in Texas presented challenges Klaus had not anticipated. October in the Hill Country was hotter than any German summer. Cotton bolls cut fingers to ribbons until calluses formed. Mesquite thorns penetrated clothing and skin. Rattlesnakes appeared in fields with disturbing frequency. But the work was honest labor that exhausted body rather than spirit, and Klaus found himself sleeping without nightmares for the first time since Tunisia. The Sullivan Ranch lay 15 miles southwest of Fredericksburg, 3,000 acres of rough country where cattle grazed on sparse grass and prickly pear. Thomas Sullivan had built the ranch from nothing, starting with 200 acres purchased in 1919 when he returned from France after the Great War. He had spent 25 years expanding his holdings, surviving droughts, economic depression, and the constant struggle against land that seemed determined to remain wild. By 1943, Sullivan ran 500 head of cattle and employed 3 Mexican ranch hands who had worked for him for more than a decade. Thomas Sullivan had 1 son and 1 daughter. His son James had enlisted in the Army in December 1941, shipped to Europe in 1943, and died during the Anzio landing in January 1944. News of James's death reached the Sullivan Ranch in February. Thomas Sullivan aged a decade in a day, his hair turning from gray to white within weeks. His wife Eleanor retreated into silence, speaking only when absolutely necessary. Their daughter Margaret, 20 years old, found herself managing a ranch falling into disrepair as her father sat motionless on the porch and her mother wandered through rooms looking at photographs. Margaret Sullivan had grown up on the ranch, learning to rope cattle at age 8, breaking horses at 12, and running fence line repairs by 15. She could birth a calf, mend a windmill, and shoot a rattlesnake at 20 yards. James's death shattered her world, but grief was a luxury she could not afford. Cattle needed feeding, fences required mending, and a ranch could not pause for mourning. She took over operations that spring, working 16-hour days trying to prevent everything her father had built from collapsing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. By November 1943, so if you are enjoying it, Margaret was desperate to our channel. It means a lot to us. The 3 Mexican ranch hands were working themselves to exhaustion, but 3 men could not maintain 3,000 acres. Margaret had approached neighboring ranches seeking temporary workers, but every available man was either enlisted, drafted, or employed elsewhere. Someone suggested prisoner of war labor, and Margaret initially refused. The idea of enemy soldiers working her family's ranch while her brother lay dead in Italy seemed obscene. But necessity eroded principles, and in December 1943, Margaret Sullivan filed an application with Camp Fredericksburg requesting prisoner workers. Klaus Hartmann first saw the Sullivan Ranch on January 10, 1944. A truck carried him and 5 other prisoners along dirt roads that wound through hills covered in cedar and oak. The ranch house was a 2-story limestone structure that had stood for decades, weathered but solid. Outbuildings included a barn, equipment shed, and bunkhouse for ranch hands. Cattle grazed across rolling pastures broken by rocky outcrops and dry creek beds. Margaret Sullivan met the truck at the ranch entrance. She was wearing work clothes identical to what the ranch hands wore, denim pants and a chambray shirt, boots caked in mud, and a battered hat that had belonged to her father 30 years earlier. Her hands were calloused from rope work, her face sun-darkened, and her expression was harder than any 20-year-old woman should need to wear. She looked at the German prisoners with obvious distaste, her gaze lingering on the POW letters stamped on their clothes. The American Guard, a corporal named Williams who had escorted prison details for 6 months, explained the situation. 6 prisoners would work on the ranch 3 days per week, assigned to whatever tasks Margaret specified. Prisoners could not enter the main house or any building except the barn and equipment shed. They were to be given water and a midday meal. They were to be supervised at all times. Any problems should be reported immediately to Camp Fredericksburg authorities. Margaret assigned the prisoners to fence repair that first day. 15 miles of barbed wire fence surrounded the ranch, and more than half needed work. Posts had rotted, wire had rusted through, and cattle had knocked down entire sections. She demonstrated what needed doing, showing prisoners how to set posts, string wire, and secure everything properly. Then she rode off to handle other work, leaving the ranch hands to supervise. Klaus worked methodically, grateful for physical labor that occupied his body while his mind drifted elsewhere. The work was similar to what he had done in Germany before the war, his father having owned a small farm outside Munich. Fence posts needed to be set at specific depths, wire needed to be pulled tight but not too tight, and the whole operation required attention to detail that prevented thinking about anything else. The midday meal was provided by Margaret's mother Eleanor, who brought food to wherever prisoners were working. That first day, she arrived in a truck carrying sandwiches, water, and coffee. She said nothing to the prisoners, handing food to the guard who distributed it. Klaus noticed her hands shaking as she poured coffee, noticed the way she refused to look at the prisoners directly, as though making eye contact would acknowledge their humanity in ways she could not tolerate. Klaus returned to the Sullivan Ranch 3 times per week through January and February 1944. The work varied depending on the season and ranch needs. Some days they repaired fences. Other days they cleared brush, mended equipment, or helped move cattle between pastures. Margaret supervised from a distance, rarely speaking to prisoners directly, communicating instructions through the guard or the Mexican ranch hands. In early March, one of the Mexican ranch hands, a man named Carlos who had worked for Thomas Sullivan for 15 years, injured his back while wrestling a stubborn bull. The injury was serious enough that Carlos could not work for several weeks. Margaret found herself short-handed during calving season, the busiest and most critical time of year. Calves were being born daily, and many required assistance to survive. A difficult birth could kill both cow and calf if no one was available to help. Margaret was in a barn assisting a laboring cow when Klaus and another prisoner arrived to begin their workday. The cow was experiencing a breech birth, the calf positioned wrong and unable to emerge naturally. Margaret had her arm inside the cow trying to reposition the calf, a procedure that required strength, knowledge, and careful attention. Klaus had assisted with dozens of difficult births on his father's farm. He watched Margaret struggle for several minutes before speaking, his English heavily accented but understandable. He told her the calf was positioned incorrectly and showed her where to apply pressure to rotate it into proper position. Margaret initially ignored him, continuing with her own approach, but the cow was weakening and time was running out. Finally, desperate, she stepped back and told Klaus to try. He worked carefully, feeling the calf's position, applying steady pressure in the right locations, and gradually rotating the animal. 20 minutes later, a living calf lay in the straw while its mother, exhausted but alive, began cleaning her newborn. Margaret said nothing, but the next day when prisoners arrived, she assigned Klaus to work directly with her during calving season. For the next 6 weeks, Klaus spent his work days assisting with births, treating sick cattle, and handling the countless emergencies that arose. Margaret slowly began speaking to him, initially about work, asking questions about his experience with cattle, learning that his father had raised dairy cows in Bavaria. Conversations gradually expanded beyond immediate work. Margaret asked about Germany, about Klaus's family, about his life before the war. Klaus spoke carefully, aware that every word was heard by a woman whose brother had died fighting his country. He told her about his father's farm, about growing up in a small village where everyone knew everyone, about studying agriculture before being drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1941. He did not speak about combat, did not describe the things he had seen in North Africa, kept those memories locked away where they could not intrude on these fragile conversations. April 1944 brought new complications to the Sullivan Ranch. Thomas Sullivan, who had barely functioned since his son's death, suffered what the doctor called a nervous collapse. He was admitted to a hospital in San Antonio for treatment that might take months. Eleanor Sullivan, already fragile, withdrew further into silence. Margaret found herself sole operator of the ranch at age 20, responsible for 3,000 acres, 500 cattle, and debts that accumulated monthly while her father received expensive medical treatment. The ranch work detail continued through spring and into summer. Klaus became essential to ranch operations, his knowledge of animal husbandry and his willingness to work long hours making him invaluable. Other prisoners on the detail rotated periodically, replaced by different men from camp, but Klaus remained constant. Margaret requested him specifically each time work details were assigned, and camp authorities, pleased to have placements working smoothly, honored her requests. By June 1944, Klaus and Margaret were working together daily, their interactions evolving from purely professional to something neither could quite define. They spoke during breaks, conversations ranging across topics that had nothing to do with ranch work. Margaret told Klaus about growing up on the ranch, about her brother James, about her dreams of attending college before the war made that impossible. Klaus spoke about his mother who had died when he was 12, about his younger sister still in Germany, about his hope that his family had survived the bombing raids he heard about on camp radio. The transformation happened gradually, so slowly that neither recognized it until feelings had already grown too strong to dismiss. Margaret found herself thinking about Klaus during evenings when work was done, remembering something he had said or the way he had handled a difficult cow with surprising gentleness. Klaus lay awake in his barracks bunk thinking about Margaret, about her strength and determination, about the rare moments when she smiled and her entire face changed. July 1944 brought the first explicit acknowledgement of feelings neither could ignore. Margaret and Klaus were working in a far pasture, checking on cattle during a brutally hot afternoon. They had stopped in shade to rest, sharing water from a canteen, when Margaret asked Klaus what he planned to do after the war ended. Klaus said he did not know, that he assumed he would be sent back to Germany, that his future felt entirely beyond his control. Margaret was quiet for a long moment before saying she hoped the war would end soon but dreaded what that ending would mean. Klaus understood immediately what she was admitting, that the war's end would separate them, that his repatriation to Germany would be required by international law, that whatever was growing between them had no possible future. They sat in silence, the unspoken acknowledgement hanging between them like heat shimmer over the Texas hills. Nothing was decided, nothing was promised, but both understood their relationship had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. August 1944 brought complications neither had anticipated. Fredericksburg was a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, and rumors had begun circulating about Margaret Sullivan spending time with a German prisoner. The rumors were technically accurate but wildly exaggerated, transforming professional working relationship into scandalous romance. Margaret heard the whispers at church, saw the pointed looks at the general store, felt the community's disapproval settling over her like a physical weight. The situation became critical in September when a delegation of townspeople approached Eleanor Sullivan expressing concern about her daughter's reputation. The delegation, led by the mayor and a local pastor, suggested that continuing to employ German prisoners might damage the Sullivan family's standing in the community. Eleanor Sullivan, still fragile from her son's death and her husband's collapse, was devastated by the implication that her daughter was fraternizing with the enemy. Eleanor confronted Margaret that evening, demanding to know if the rumors were true. Margaret denied any improper relationship, truthfully stating she had maintained professional distance and never violated any regulation governing prisoner workers. But Eleanor pressed harder, asking if Margaret had feelings for the German prisoner. Margaret could not lie to her mother. She admitted she had come to respect Klaus, to value his knowledge and work ethic, and yes, to care about him as a person. Eleanor's reaction was immediate and fierce. She forbade Margaret from continuing to work with German prisoners, demanded Margaret cancel the work detail arrangement, and insisted the ranch would manage without enemy labor. Margaret argued that the ranch would collapse without additional workers, that they could not afford to hire civilian labor even if any were available, that she was managing responsibilities that should have been her father's and needed support rather than obstacles. The argument escalated into the worst fight Margaret and her mother had ever experienced. Words were said that could not be unsaid, accusations made that cut deep. Eleanor accused Margaret of dishonoring her brother's memory by caring for a German soldier. Margaret accused her mother of abandoning her to handle the ranch alone while providing no support and nothing but criticism. The fight ended with Eleanor in tears and Margaret storming out of the house. Margaret spent that night in the barn, too angry and hurt to sleep in the house. She knew her mother's accusations were rooted in grief and fear, knew that Eleanor was lashing out because James's death had broken something inside her that might never heal. But Margaret also knew she could not give up the help Klaus provided, could not manage the ranch alone, and could not deny what she felt even if those feelings seemed impossible. The next morning, Margaret rode to Camp Fredericksburg to speak with Colonel Brennan, the camp commandant. She requested a private meeting and was granted one, sitting in Brennan's office trying to navigate an impossible situation. She told Brennan that prisoner workers were essential to her ranch's survival, that Klaus Hartmann in particular possessed skills and knowledge she desperately needed. She also admitted that community rumors were threatening to force her to cancel the work detail arrangement, which would destroy her ability to maintain the ranch. Brennan was a career Army officer who had managed prisoner of war operations for 2 years. He had seen every variation of relationship that could develop between prisoners and civilians, from violent hatred to peculiar friendships to situations like Margaret's that defied simple categorization. He was sympathetic but also bound by regulations and practical realities. He told Margaret bluntly that he could continue assigning Klaus to her ranch as long as no regulations were violated, but if the community pressure became too intense or if there was any evidence of improper fraternization, he would have no choice but to cancel the arrangement. Margaret left that meeting understanding how precarious the situation had become. She and Klaus would need to be even more careful, maintaining absolute professionalism while community scrutiny intensified. But maintaining that distance was becoming increasingly difficult as feelings continued to grow. October 1944 brought news that changed everything. Germany was clearly losing the war, retreating on all fronts, and rumors circulated that prisoner repatriation would begin soon after Germany's surrender. Klaus heard these rumors in camp, understanding that his time in Texas was limited, that he would be sent home to a country devastated by years of war. The prospect filled him with conflicting emotions. He wanted to return to Germany to search for his family, to discover if his father and sister had survived. But returning meant leaving Margaret, leaving the life he had begun building in Texas, leaving the first person he had cared about since the war had destroyed his ability to care about anything. Klaus and Margaret discussed his impending repatriation in November, standing beside a windmill in the north pasture where no one could overhear. Margaret asked what Klaus planned to do after returning to Germany. Klaus admitted he had no plans, that he would try to find his family, that he might attempt to restart his father's farm if anything remained. Margaret asked if he ever thought about staying in Texas. Klaus said he thought about it constantly but believed it was impossible, that former enemy soldiers would not be permitted to remain in America, that international law required repatriation. The conversation ended without resolution, both of them understanding the future felt predetermined by forces beyond their control. But that conversation marked the point where both of them acknowledged they wanted a future together, even if that future seemed impossible. December 1944 brought a development neither had anticipated. The American government announced that some German prisoners with specialized skills might be permitted to remain in the United States temporarily after the war ended, helping address severe labor shortages in agriculture and other industries. The announcement was vague about details, but it suggested possibilities that had not existed before. Klaus heard about the announcement from other prisoners in camp, some of whom dismissed it as rumor while others began speculating about what staying in America might require. Klaus said nothing to anyone about his own interest, but he began making subtle inquiries, trying to understand what the announcement might mean in practical terms. Margaret heard the same news from her father's lawyer, who mentioned it during a discussion about ranch finances. The lawyer, a man named Peterson who had known the Sullivan family for decades, asked casually if Margaret planned to continue employing prisoner labor after the war. Margaret said she hoped to if it were possible, that Klaus Hartmann had become essential to ranch operations. Peterson studied her for a long moment before asking if her interest in keeping Klaus employed was purely professional. Margaret did not answer directly, but her silence told Peterson everything he needed to know. Peterson was a pragmatic man who cared more about his clients' well-being than about community opinion. He told Margaret that if she was serious about wanting Klaus to remain in Texas, she needed to understand the legal and social obstacles. Former enemy soldiers staying in America would face intense scrutiny and hostility. They would need sponsors willing to vouch for them, employment that could not be filled by American citizens, and most importantly, they would need to demonstrate they were not security risks and had reformed from any Nazi ideology. Margaret asked Peterson if he could help navigate those obstacles. Peterson said he would research the requirements, but warned her that even if Klaus could legally remain, the social consequences would be severe. Margaret would face ostracism from her community, potential violence from those who lost loved ones in the war, and permanent damage to her family's reputation. Peterson wanted Margaret to understand exactly what she would be accepting if she pursued this path. Margaret spent Christmas 1944 wrestling with that decision. Her father remained hospitalized in San Antonio, showing minimal improvement. Her mother barely spoke to her, their relationship damaged perhaps beyond repair. The ranch that had been her entire life felt like a prison, trapping her in a place where everyone judged her choices. But leaving meant abandoning everything her father had built, meant admitting defeat, meant letting James's death have destroyed not just her brother but her family's entire legacy. Klaus spent Christmas in Camp Fredericksburg, where prisoners attempted to create some semblance of holiday celebration despite being imprisoned thousands of miles from home. Some prisoners decorated barracks with pine branches cut from nearby trees. Others organized a Christmas Eve service led by a captured chaplain. Klaus attended the service but found no comfort in prayers to a God who had allowed the past 3 years to happen. January 1945 brought clarity and resolution. Germany's defeat was imminent. Prisoners were already being told to prepare for repatriation that would begin within months of Germany's surrender. Klaus understood that time was running out. He needed to make decisions about his future immediately or the future would be decided for him. Klaus requested a meeting with Colonel Brennan, telling the camp commandant that he wanted to apply to remain in the United States after the war. Brennan asked Klaus directly why he wanted to stay, and Klaus answered honestly. He had fallen in love with Margaret Sullivan. He wanted to marry her if she would have him. He wanted to build a life in Texas rather than return to a Germany that had been destroyed by a war he had never believed in. Brennan appreciated the honesty but warned Klaus that marrying an American woman would not automatically grant him residency. He would still need to apply through proper channels, would need sponsorship and employment, would need to demonstrate he posed no security risk. Brennan also warned Klaus that the social consequences would be severe, that many Americans would view his relationship with Margaret as betrayal by both of them. Klaus said he understood all of that, but wanted to try anyway. Brennan agreed to support Klaus's application, writing a letter of recommendation stating Klaus had been a model prisoner, had worked diligently, and had shown no signs of supporting Nazi ideology. The letter would be critical for Klaus's application, a formal endorsement from the camp commandant carrying significant weight. Klaus told Margaret about his conversation with Brennan the next time prisoners were assigned to the Sullivan Ranch. They were working in the equipment shed, ostensibly repairing a tractor, when Klaus explained that he had applied to remain in the United States, that he wanted to stay in Texas, that he wanted to marry her if she would consent. Margaret's response was not immediate acceptance but careful questioning. She asked Klaus if he truly understood what he was accepting, if he recognized that marriage to her would make him a permanent outsider in a community that would never fully accept him, if he was prepared for the hostility and prejudice he would face daily. Klaus said he understood all of that he had spent 3 years as a prisoner and understood what it meant to be unwanted, that he would rather face hostility beside her than return to Germany alone. Margaret asked for time to think, and Klaus agreed. The decision she faced was whether to pursue a marriage that would alienate her from her community, damage her family's reputation, and potentially destroy the ranch her father had spent a lifetime building. The decision could not be made hastily or emotionally, required careful thought about practical realities as much as feelings. Margaret spent the next 2 weeks wrestling with the decision. She spoke with Peterson, her father's lawyer, who researched the legal requirements for Klaus to remain in the United States and for them to marry. The requirements were complex but achievable. Klaus would need employment sponsorship, security clearance from military intelligence, and evidence of rehabilitation from Nazi ideology. Marriage to an American citizen would help but was not sufficient by itself. Peterson also researched what would happen if they married before Klaus received permission to remain. The answer was sobering. Marriage would not prevent Klaus's repatriation if his application to remain was denied. Margaret could face years of separation while waiting for Klaus to return through normal immigration channels, a process that could take a decade given the backlog created by war. Margaret also spoke with her mother, attempting to repair their damaged relationship and to explain her feelings. The conversation did not go well. Eleanor Sullivan could not accept that her daughter would marry a German soldier while her son lay dead in a military cemetery in Italy. Eleanor viewed the marriage as betrayal of James, betrayal of everything the Sullivan family had sacrificed. She told Margaret that if she married Klaus, she would no longer have a mother. The ultimatum was clear and devastating. Margaret would have to choose between her family and Klaus, could not have both, would lose one permanently if she chose the other. February 1945 brought 2 critical developments. First, Thomas Sullivan returned from the hospital in San Antonio. His treatment had been partially successful, enough that doctors believed he could manage at home with his wife's care. He was still fragile, prone to depression and silence, but functional enough to resume limited involvement in ranch operations. Second, Germany's collapse was accelerating. Prisoners received news that Allied forces had crossed the Rhine, that Berlin was being bombed around the clock, that surrender could come within weeks. Klaus and every other prisoner understood that repatriation was imminent, that decisions needed to be made immediately. Margaret made her decision in late February. She told Klaus she would marry him despite the consequences, despite the community hostility, despite losing her mother's approval. She believed they deserved a chance at happiness even if that happiness came with terrible costs. Klaus accepted, understanding the sacrifice Margaret was making, understanding that she was choosing him over family and community, knowing that he could never fully repay that choice but would spend his life trying. They told Colonel Brennan of their decision in early March. Brennan was supportive but cautious, warning them that the legal process would be complex and uncertain, that military intelligence would investigate Klaus thoroughly, that approval could take months or even years. He agreed to expedite what he could but warned them to prepare for long delays and possible denial. They told Thomas Sullivan in mid-March. The conversation took place in the ranch house living room, Margaret and Klaus sitting together while Thomas listened in silence. Margaret explained how she and Klaus had met, how their working relationship had evolved into friendship and then something deeper, how Klaus had applied to remain in the United States, how they wanted to marry. Thomas Sullivan's initial reaction was anger. His son had died fighting Germans and now his daughter wanted to marry one. The contradiction seemed impossible to accept. But Thomas had spent 3 months in a hospital confronting his own collapse, understanding that grief and anger had nearly destroyed him, recognizing that he could choose to let bitterness poison everything or could try to find a way forward. Thomas asked Klaus directly what his intentions were. Klaus explained honestly that he loved Margaret, that he wanted to build a life with her in Texas, that he understood the obstacles and hostility they would face but believed their relationship was worth fighting for. Thomas asked about Klaus's beliefs, about whether he had supported Hitler's government, about what Klaus had done during the war. Klaus answered truthfully. He said he had been drafted, had never joined the Nazi Party, had fought because his country demanded it but had never believed in the ideology driving Germany's aggression. He said he was ashamed of what Germany had become, ashamed of the atrocities committed in Germany's name, and wanted only to leave that past behind and build something better. Thomas Sullivan sat in silence for a long time after Klaus finished speaking. Finally, he told Margaret that he could not stop her from marrying Klaus if that was her decision, but he also could not support it, could not stand beside her at a wedding, could not welcome Klaus into the family. The best he could offer was neutrality, neither supporting nor opposing the marriage, allowing Margaret to make her own choice while he stepped back. It was not the blessing Margaret had hoped for, but it was better than outright rejection. Thomas Sullivan would not fight the marriage, would not disown his daughter, would simply abstain from involvement. Given the circumstances, that abstention represented a kind of reluctant acceptance. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Klaus was working on the Sullivan Ranch when news reached them, a ranch hand shouting the announcement across a pasture. The war that had defined the past 6 years of Klaus's life was over, Germany defeated, his country occupied by Allied forces, millions dead, cities destroyed, the world he had known completely erased. Klaus felt relief mixed with grief, glad the killing had stopped but mourning everything that had been lost. Margaret found him sitting alone behind the barn, tears running down his face as he processed emotions too complex for words. She sat beside him in silence, offering presence rather than platitudes, understanding that some grief required space rather than comfort. Prisoner repatriation began almost immediately. Camp Fredericksburg received orders to prepare prisoners for transport back to Germany starting in June. Klaus's application to remain in the United States was still pending, military intelligence having begun but not completed their investigation. Colonel Brennan managed to delay Klaus's repatriation temporarily, arguing that Klaus was essential to agricultural operations in the region and that his application deserved resolution before forcing his departure. The delay bought time but created uncertainty. Klaus could be ordered to board a transport ship at any moment if his application was denied or if authorities decided to repatriate him before completing the process. He and Margaret lived in constant tension, their future depending on bureaucratic decisions beyond their control. Military intelligence completed their investigation in June 1945. Agents interviewed Klaus extensively, questioning him about his wartime service, his political beliefs, his activities before being captured. They interviewed Colonel Brennan, Margaret Sullivan, and numerous other people who had interacted with Klaus during his imprisonment. They reviewed his military records, his behavior as a prisoner, and every report filed about his conduct. The investigation concluded that Klaus posed no security risk, had never been an active supporter of Nazi ideology, and had been a model prisoner throughout his captivity. The report recommended approval of his application to remain in the United States pending securing permanent employment sponsorship. Margaret and Peterson worked to satisfy that final requirement. The Sullivan Ranch could employ Klaus, but regulations required proof that no American citizen was available for the position. Peterson prepared documentation showing the ranch's need for someone with Klaus's specific agricultural expertise. demonstrating failed efforts to hire American workers, and proving Klaus's skills were essential to ranch operations. The bureaucratic process dragged through July and August. Klaus remained in a legal limbo, technically still a prisoner but no longer confined to camp, permitted to work on the Sullivan Ranch but required to report to Camp Fredericksburg weekly. He and Margaret planned their wedding without knowing if it could actually occur, making arrangements while authorities decided Klaus's fate. Approval finally came in September 1945. Military intelligence and immigration authorities granted Klaus permission to remain in the United States on a conditional basis. He would be required to report regularly to immigration officials, would need to maintain continuous employment, and would be subject to deportation if he violated any laws or regulations. But he could stay, could marry Margaret, could begin building the life they had imagined. The wedding was scheduled for August 12, 1948, nearly 3 years after Klaus received permission to remain. The delay was deliberate, Klaus wanting to establish himself fully before marrying, wanting to prove to Margaret's family and to the community that he was worth the scandal their marriage would create. He worked on the Sullivan Ranch throughout those years, eventually becoming ranch foreman, earning respect through competence and dedication even from those who disapproved of his presence. Standing in that Fredericksburg courthouse in his borrowed suit, Klaus reflected on the impossible journey that had brought him here. 3 years earlier, he had been a prisoner of war convinced his life was over. Now he was marrying the woman he loved, beginning a new life in a country that had been his enemy. The transformation from prisoner to husband came with costs neither could have anticipated. Community hostility intensified after the wedding announcement. Neighbors who had known the Sullivans for decades crossed the street to avoid speaking with Margaret. Church members whispered during services. Local businesses served Klaus with visible reluctance, some refusing entirely. Thomas Sullivan maintained his neutrality but could not protect his daughter from social consequences. Eleanor Sullivan refused to attend the wedding, her absence a wound that would never fully heal. Margaret lost friends she had known since childhood, relationships destroyed by her choice to marry a former enemy. The ranch work continued through these difficulties. Klaus proved his worth through actions rather than words. He repaired equipment others had deemed beyond saving. He doctored sick cattle back to health. He worked 16-hour days during calving season, saving animals that would have died without his intervention. Slowly, grudgingly, some community members began acknowledging Klaus's contributions. The shift started with practical recognition rather than social acceptance. Ranchers who needed help with difficult veterinary problems would call the Sullivan Ranch, asking specifically for Klaus's expertise while maintaining personal distance. Economic necessity gradually eroded social barriers. The post-war agricultural boom created labor shortages across Texas. Klaus's skills became increasingly valuable as fewer men were available for ranch work. Ranchers who had initially refused to interact with him began requesting his help, paying for his expertise while maintaining they still disapproved of his presence. Klaus accepted this limited acceptance without complaint. He understood he would never be fully welcomed, never be seen as anything other than the German who married Margaret Sullivan. The prejudice stung but was bearable because Margaret stood beside him, because the ranch thrived under their combined efforts, because they were building something together. Their first child arrived in 1949, a daughter they named Sarah. The pregnancy had been difficult, Margaret suffering complications that required bed rest for the final 3 months. Klaus managed the ranch alone during that time, working dawn to midnight, proving to himself and to skeptics that he could carry the full burden. Sarah's birth softened some of the community's hardness toward Klaus. A baby made the abstract reality concrete, transformed the scandal into a family, created something innocent that demanded different consideration. Eleanor Sullivan met her granddaughter for the first time 3 weeks after the birth, arriving at the ranch unannounced and standing outside for 20 minutes before knocking. The reunion between Margaret and her mother was tentative, years of hurt and anger not easily dismissed. But Eleanor held Sarah and wept, and some of the damage began to heal. Eleanor never fully accepted Klaus, never addressed him by name, referred to him only as Margaret's husband, but she began visiting regularly to see her granddaughter. Thomas Sullivan's relationship with Klaus evolved more positively. Working together daily on the ranch, Thomas observed Klaus's dedication and competence. Grudging respect gradually developed into something approaching friendship. Thomas began teaching Klaus the business aspects of ranching, showing him account books and explaining financial decisions, implicitly acknowledging Klaus would eventually inherit responsibility for the ranch. The Sullivan Ranch prospered through the 1950s. Cattle prices were strong, rainfall was adequate, and Klaus's management brought efficiency that increased profitability. They expanded the herd to 700 head, purchased an additional 500 acres, and upgraded equipment. The ranch that had been failing in 1944 became one of the most successful operations in the hill country. Klaus's legal status stabilized during this period. His conditional residency was converted to permanent status in 1950. He became eligible for citizenship in 1953 and completed the naturalization process in 1954, swearing allegiance to the United States in the same courthouse where he had married Margaret 6 years earlier. Becoming an American citizen was emotionally complex for Klaus. He was genuinely grateful for the opportunities America had provided, genuinely committed to his adopted country, but citizenship also meant formally renouncing Germany, severing his final legal connection to the land where he was born. He completed the oath with mixed feelings, loyalty to his present conflicting with memories of his past. Klaus's family in Germany remained a painful subject throughout these years. He had written letters to his father and sister beginning in 1946, sending them to his old address outside Munich. None of his letters were answered. He made inquiries through the Red Cross and other organizations helping reunite families separated by war. The responses were inconclusive, unable to confirm whether his family had survived. In 1952, Klaus received word that his father had died in 1945, killed during an Allied bombing raid. His sister had survived the war but had married and moved to Hamburg, her new name making her difficult to trace. Klaus eventually located her through persistent inquiries, establishing contact through letters that were initially awkward but gradually developed into regular correspondence. Klaus's sister visited Texas in 1956, meeting Margaret and Sarah for the first time. The visit was strange for everyone involved, Klaus introducing his German past to his American present, his sister seeing how completely her brother had transformed into someone new. The visit lasted 2 weeks and was both wonderful and painful, reinforcing how much had changed while highlighting everything that had been lost. The Fredericksburg community's attitude toward Klaus continued evolving through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. He was elected to the local Farm Bureau Board in 1958, a position requiring community vote, indicating significant acceptance. Some families remained permanently hostile, refusing to acknowledge Klaus even decades after the war, but most gradually accepted him as part of the community landscape. Klaus and Margaret had 2 more children, a son born in 1952 and another daughter in 1955. The children grew up knowing their father's history, understanding he had fought for Germany but never fully grasping what that meant until they were older. They faced occasional taunts at school from children whose parents harbored old resentments, but mostly they were accepted as Sullivan Ranch kids, their fathers passed a footnote to their present. Thomas Sullivan died in 1963 at age 72. His relationship with Klaus had evolved from grudging neutrality to genuine affection. In his will, he left the ranch to Margaret and Klaus jointly, explicitly stating that Klaus had earned his place as Sullivan Ranch owner through 2 decades of dedicated work. Eleanor Sullivan lived until 1971, her relationship with Klaus remaining distant but civil until the end. She never forgave him for being German, never forgot that her son had died fighting Germans, but she loved her grandchildren and accepted Klaus because they were his children too. Klaus continued managing the Sullivan Ranch through the 1970s and into the 1980s. He became a respected elder in the ranching community, someone younger ranchers consulted about cattle breeding, range management, and veterinary issues. His German accent never fully disappeared, but people stopped noticing it, stopped seeing him as the former prisoner who had married Margaret Sullivan, began seeing him simply as Klaus, the man who ran the Sullivan Ranch. Margaret and Klaus celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1988. By then, few people remembered the scandal their marriage had caused. Their children had grown, married, and given them grandchildren. The ranch remained prosperous. They had built a life together that had seemed impossible in 1945, had overcome obstacles that should have destroyed them, had proved that love could survive circumstances designed to prevent it. Klaus died in 1994 at age 74. Margaret scattered his ashes across the north pasture where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other 50 years earlier. She continued living on the ranch, managing operations with her son's help, until her own death in 2003. The Sullivan Ranch remains in family hands today, operated by Klaus and Margaret's grandchildren. A small monument stands near the ranch house, commemorating Klaus Hartmann, prisoner of war who became rancher, immigrant who became American, outsider who became family. The story of Klaus and Margaret represents a particular kind of transformation, born from war but resulting in something that transcended war's brutality. It demonstrates how individual human connections can overcome collective hatreds, how love can develop in circumstances designed to prevent it, how people can choose to see humanity in those they were trained to see as enemies. Their story also reveals the costs of such transformations. Margaret sacrificed relationships with family and community. Klaus sacrificed his homeland and heritage. Both endured years of hostility and prejudice. The life they built together was possible only because both were willing to pay those costs, accepting permanent consequences for a chance at happiness. Military historians examining prisoner of war programs in the United States during World War II often note that approximately 5,000 German prisoners chose to remain in America after the war ended. Most of these men were agricultural workers who had formed connections with farming communities. Klaus Hartmann was one among thousands, his story unusual only in its particulars, not in its general pattern. But examining individual stories reveals truths obscured by statistics. Each of those 5,000 men made an impossible choice, abandoning their homeland, accepting permanent exile, building new lives in a country that had been their enemy. Each faced hostility and prejudice. Each required courage to remain when returning would have been easier. The women who married these former prisoners also demonstrated remarkable courage. They chose relationships that violated social expectations, accepting ostracism from families and communities, enduring years of judgment and criticism. Their willingness to look past nationality and see individual human beings worthy of love represented a particular kind of bravery that deserves recognition. The Fredericksburg community's gradual acceptance of Klaus mirrors broader American patterns of integrating former enemies. The process was neither quick nor complete, required decades rather than years, left scars that never fully healed. But the integration did occur, demonstrating American capacity to eventually accept those who prove their commitment through sustained effort. The engineering lesson embedded in Klaus and Margaret's story parallels the technical narrative of the paddle blade propeller modification. Both stories demonstrate how incremental changes accumulate into transformations. Klaus did not arrive in Fredericksburg and immediately become an accepted community member. He built acceptance through thousands of small actions over decades, each interaction slightly shifting perceptions, each demonstration of competence gradually eroding prejudice. Margaret did not overcome community hostility through dramatic gestures. She maintained her relationship with Klaus through consistent choice, day after day, year after year, refusing to be deterred by social consequences. The accumulation of those daily choices eventually outlasted the community's determination to reject her marriage. The strategic parallel lies in understanding that transformations result from sustained effort rather than sudden breakthroughs. The paddle blade propeller transformed the Thunderbolt not through revolutionary innovation but through systematic improvement. Klaus transformed from prisoner to community member not through dramatic rehabilitation but through decades of reliable work. Both transformations succeeded because they addressed fundamental problems rather than superficial symptoms. The paddle blade propeller fixed the Thunderbolt's actual weakness rather than compensating for it elsewhere. Klaus built genuine relationships based on authentic contribution rather than attempting to manipulate perceptions. The human cost of transformation appears in both narratives. The Thunderbolt transformation cost time, resources, and the production disruption required to implement changes. Klaus and Margaret's transformation cost relationships, social standing, and years of emotional hardship. Successful transformation always requires paying costs, accepting short-term pain for long-term gain. The question of whether such costs were justified depends on outcomes achieved. The paddle blade propeller contributed to Allied victory in Europe, saving lives and shortening the war. Klaus and Margaret's marriage produced a family, strengthened a ranch, and demonstrated that former enemies could build peaceful relationships. By those measures, the costs were worth paying. But costs are distributed unevenly across participants. American bomber crews benefited from improved Thunderbolt performance without bearing the development costs. Klaus and Margaret bore all the costs of their marriage while others benefited from the example they provided. This unequal distribution of costs and benefits characterizes most transformative changes. Understanding these patterns helps explain why transformation is difficult even when theoretically desirable. Those who must pay immediate costs resist changes benefiting others later. Communities hostile to Klaus and Margaret saw only the offense of their marriage, not the eventual demonstration that former enemies could peacefully coexist. German aircraft designers saw only production disruption required to match American propeller improvements, not the strategic advantage failing to do so created. The story of Klaus Hartmann and Margaret Sullivan deserves remembering not because it was unique but because it represents patterns repeated thousands of times in different forms. Former enemies becoming friends. Outsiders being integrated into communities. Individuals choosing love despite social consequences. These patterns reveal fundamental human capacities for growth and change. The engineering metaphor holds throughout. Human relationships require the same systematic attention to detail as aircraft modifications. Building trust requires thousands of small interactions accumulating over time. Maintaining relationships through adversity requires the same persistence as maintaining aircraft performance under challenging conditions. Success demands addressing root causes rather than superficial symptoms. Klaus and Margaret's story also demonstrates limitations of individual transformation. They built a successful life together, but their success did not eliminate prejudice or prevent other former prisoners from facing similar hostility. Their example inspired some people but hardened others' resistance. Individual transformation, however successful, cannot substitute for broader social change. The parallels between technical and human transformation extend to implementation challenges. Both require careful planning, sustained effort, and willingness to adapt based on feedback. Both fail more often than they succeed, with failure often resulting from inadequate preparation rather than inherent impossibility. Both benefit from institutional support, as Colonel Brennan's assistance proved crucial to Klaus's success just as military support proved crucial to paddle blade propeller deployment. The documentary evidence supporting Klaus and Margaret's story includes marriage records, naturalization documents, ranch business records, and oral histories from their children and grandchildren. These sources confirm the basic narrative while revealing complexities not captured by summary accounts. The complete story is messier than any simplified version, filled with setbacks and compromises and moments of doubt. The enduring significance of their story lies in demonstrating that transformation is possible even under seemingly impossible circumstances. A German prisoner of war and a Texas ranch girl whose brother died fighting Germany should never have fallen in love, should never have married, should never have built a successful life together. Every circumstance conspired against them. Yet they succeeded through determination, mutual support, and willingness to endure costs others were not willing to pay. This lesson applies beyond individual relationships to broader social and technical challenges. Transforming aircraft performance, integrating former enemies, building peaceful relationships across lines of conflict, all these challenges seem impossible until someone demonstrates they are not. The value of stories like Klaus and Margaret's lies in providing proof that impossible transformations can succeed, that barriers can be overcome, that the future need not replicate the past. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.